Well, hello, everyone. To all my fellow practitioners out there, thank you for having me. Truly humbled to be here. Honored to share this space with you. Looking forward to everything. Um, I really think over the next 2 days, we will have a wonderful time with all the incredible speakers, the workshops, all of the events, and confident we will transform our commitment into action, and all of us will go out and contribute to making the world a better place. Before I begin, I would like to thank Carmen Bueno and Max Matus, as well as the entire GBAS team and board for all that you've done here today. And I'd also like to thank the Universidad Ibero for graciously hosting us, as well as really you all. Without you all, we wouldn't be out in the world making the difference that we do. So I really appreciate it, the work that everybody does here today. And so I'm going to jump right into it. I heard some threads in the opening remarks that relate to what I talked to, and there's also some threads that are a little bit different. But I am intentionally going to talk today, about what I see as something emergent. And so in my worldview, from what I see in my practice in the US and the space that I'm in, I believe we stand on the edge of a very disruptive transformation in business brought on by the rapidly emerging AI revolution. To stay relevant, I argue that business anthropology must embrace a digital turn, whether our focus is organizational culture, marketing, advertising, consumer research, and UX, or really anything else that anybody out there may be doing. And though I see this as presenting challenges, I think it also creates opportunities for us to develop new theories, new methods, enhance our communication abilities, reach a broader audience, and really remain relevant in this new context where we're going to have increasingly a lot of competition. And so I think if we move quickly, we can ensure that business anthropology continues to provide valuable insights the way we always have, and really continue sharing our perspectives that are so needed in this new era of AI. The good news about this is that I actually see that this is already happening. I see these early signals of a digital turn that is underway, brought on by both internal and external forces. And so I'll talk about some of the internal forces of what I see happening in the conversations that I'm engaged in and the conversations that many of you are engaged in, as well as the external forces in terms of what's happening in the broader business climate. And so I'm essentially going to kind of run through the talk today where in many ways I'm laying out the internal trends that I see, the external trends that I see, and then really wrapping up with sort of like the future as I see it. Related to this point, I see that there are hints that digital anthropology as sort of a discourse may actually overtake design. And a lot of us here today are designers. We're very interested in the process of design. I don't see that going away. I don't see any of those other sort of focal points going away. I just see a new layering happening in which, maybe digital anthropology is poised to take over as this dominant narrative as I'm describing. And so I'm going to base this on my podcasts and on some research that I'm doing that involves, like, say, looking at the JBA, the Journal of Business Anthropology, as well as other personal conversations and, a number of other sort of digital traces, if you will, that I've been looking at as part of this research. So to start that, let me sort of just step back and tell you a little bit about how this really all started. On February 13th, 2020, I was invited back to the University of North Texas to give a talk to really the next generation of anthropologists. There, I had earned my applied anthropology degree studying under Susan Squires. And so I was very pleased to be back that day, sort of sharing with, the next generation of students. Then a few weeks later, on March 7th, I ended up on the iconic sort of red dot of the TEDx stage, where I was giving a talk that was quite different, still anthropological. It was still based on my research, but now my task was to bring the research to a much broader audience than, say, at UNT, where I was speaking to other anthropologists. This time it was really about bringing it to the public at large. And that's something that has stayed that desire has stayed very true for me through my podcast, which I try to make very accessible, through my blogs, which I try to make very accessible. And so at that time, I remember being like incredibly excited by these sort of back-to-back opportunities. It really seemed like things were coming together, having the opportunity to share, to give back. And then 4 days after my TED Talk, the world as we knew it came to a screeching halt, right? WHO declares a pandemic, no more academic conferences, no more work meetings, no more in-face get-together. And so there I am, like probably many of us, searching around, like figuring out, well, what am I going to do in this period of time to stay connected, have some sense of community? And so, needing an outlet, I decided I would get into podcasting. Not the first, there's been many that have come before me. in the anthropology space. And even if you look at the American Anthropological Association's podcast page, you'll see probably about 20 of them at this point in time. A wonderful collection of resources out there for you to listen to. But I was, having my business background, I was very much interested in taking a sort of a different approach, thinking about competitive advantage, if you will, and really trying to eke out a space that would be mine to define. And so though I was interested in bringing people together, sharing conversations, building community, it was also very much about careers and helping individuals who might be academic anthropologists that want to transition into business, make that shift into both business broadly and into UX very specifically, between the two podcasts. And so building on that, the last piece was I, again, wanted to make it very accessible. I wanted it to be in a language that everybody could listen to, take away something, whether you're an anthropologist, a designer, a strategist, a product manager, or just any other sort of functional group in business. And so that came together in my two podcasts, Anthropology in Business and Anthro to UX. And since then, I launched in January 2021. And since then, I'm honored to say, and I'm going to call out a bunch of names here because I'm honored to say I've had the opportunity to have on many of you and learn from all of you in that time. So Max Matus, Lucia Laurent Neva, Oscar Barrera, Autumn McDonald, Stephen Garcia, Gigi Taylor, Alexandra Mack, Elizabeth Bridey, Timothy Malafite, just to name a few. And hopefully I can have many of you more on so that we can continue sharing a global perspective of anthropology and business. Now, when I started, I really had no sense of what that would become, where it would go, how it would grow, what I would learn. But now standing here 2.5 years later, I think there are a few themes, if you will, that have emerged that are very relevant to our time. And while there are more themes, I think there's two that are important for what I see, happening in the broader business context. And so first, this ongoing evolution of business anthropology, which has always, played out, is entering a new phase as I see it, one that is dominated by digital and specifically AI. Increasingly, I hear guests talking about, digital methods, gesturing towards AI, and future states that look very different than they do today. And in this new context, I believe we will certainly need to build, on our rich trend, on our rich foundation and traditions. None of that's going away. We're going to carry that forward. But I also think we need to think about new ways to create, new ways of knowing, new ways of doing. And I think this is summed up well by somebody who is on the podcast, Honest Christian Monk, who runs the Technoanthropology Lab at Aalborg University. He said, "I'm still interested in the same thing. Is there a way to abductively, from the bottom up, discover cultural patterns and use the data to get a sense of different points of view on the world other than our own, which to my mind is very ethnographic?" And now the second theme that really jumps out at me is this need to stay relevant. I think that's going to become more challenging in this evolving landscape that's going to be increasingly dominated by digital or AI specifically. And if we thought we had issues in the past, with getting a seat at the table with other like social or applied sciences sometimes, maybe some of those that are maybe more quant oriented, I think the stakes have just been raised significantly. In the coming period, there is a risk of us falling behind, this broader digital turn. And so that's why I think we need to adopt it in our field. And if we do that, I think we can keep pace with the external environment that's changing, while also within organizations sort of develop the skill sets so that we can stay relevant with others in the organization. And I'll get to some data that points out like how organizations are looking, what kind of skills they're looking for. So in my worldview, by blending AI and, based on what I hear from everybody, by blending AI, data science, and ethnography, I believe we can develop new iterative mixed method approaches that can help us really increase our understanding, make sense of increasingly uncertain environments in these coming years. And Katie Hillier of the Live Center addressed that when talking about the Live Center's mission, when she said, "It's about advancing the investment in digital tools and methods to bring about anthropology and digital innovation to every corner of the world. We need a blended approach to understand complex issues such as ethics, privacy, and bias." But of course, it's not also just about methods nor sense-making alone. It's about, in my worldview, connecting with stakeholders based on what I hear in the podcast, and whether that's in or out of business, so that we increase our visibility and relatability of anthropology broadly. And I think digital tools can help us do that. With the latest tech, with the latest media, we can communicate complex ideas and get our message out to more people in more ways that meet them where they are. And so this need to communicate has shown up in really all of, the vast majority of my podcasts. It's a sort of a recurring topic that comes up. And I think we can actually even use digital tools, right? And I'm going to demonstrate some digital tools today just as a point of reference. But we can use this to sort of as a balancing act to kind of confirm or deny what it is that we are hearing in our own research, in our own embodied experience when we're out there. And so creating a semantic text network of my podcast, of all 58 hours of the podcast, which you see on the right, and then using natural language processing via generative pre-trained transformer to do topic modeling on that data, the most important theme that comes out across all of the podcasts is communication skills, which again, maybe the exact wording of that is a little different than the way I was thinking about it, but it reinforces this topic that always comes up on the podcast. And I find this particularly true of the Anthro to UX guests who have a tendency to work in organizations maybe more than some of the anthropology and business individuals, as a lot of the latter group is often independent consultants. And so the Anthro to UX group, they're often vying for recognition among data scientists, and other closely related disciplines, if you will, within their organizations. And so when they talk, in those podcasts, in roughly half of the 58 hours, and I run the same process, the topic that comes out most is, again, effective communication. So this need to sort of, what this looks like often is the need to be brief, to be clear, to really, get this streamlined in a way that their stakeholders can make sense of that. And for many of these individuals, that comes down to the sort of classic, slide deck at this point in time that is so normative in business. And Nadine Levin really stresses this when she says, the other thing that I've spent a lot of time learning is moving away from academic tendencies around writing and presentations, learning how to communicate things in decks. If you can't talk in a way that's simple or relevant to your stakeholders, you are not going to have impact. And while a deck might be sufficient today, I suggest that that's likely not going to be the case much more when we have potentially a metaverse that we might be communicating in. And if not that, at least, increased abilities to create advanced digital visualizations and using audio and video, like podcasts. Somebody at Meta talked about potentially creating podcasts internally to share information among the team. And so with that all in mind, I think it's worth exploring this ongoing evolution, the need to stay relevant, and how both of those signal this digital turn in business anthropology, why that's an opportunity, and what that may look like in practice. This evolution that I'm speaking of, and now this turn to digital is, the ongoing evolution of our practice is not necessarily something new, right? I think we'd all argue that we have been evolving the entire time like anything else, like any other discipline would. In many ways, that's been around the focus, and you could say that we've had a shift from maybe organizational culture as the dominant paradigm to maybe then an era of marketing, advertising, and consumer research. And arguably right now, for maybe the past decade, you could say we've been, heavy on design. And so that I see is the dominant narrative now, but I also see it shifting to digital, as I'm saying. But before getting to the digital turn, let me demonstrate why I think design is really the dominant narrative. That really came out, one thing that really struck me was in a AAA session, an executive session at the American Anthropological Association last year at their annual meeting put on by Barry Dornfeld and I think Matthew Hill and maybe Steve Thompson and another of others who are in the room. Patty Sutherland, who many of you may know, said something that really struck me. She said, when I started, I always called what we did consumer research, but if I were starting now, I would probably call myself a design anthropologist. And now for me, Patty's a luminary in the consumer research space. She's read many of the books, the articles that we hold very dear to us. And so that really sort of struck a chord that, based on and building on things that I have already heard. But of course, I don't base my assertion on that. Even in the GBAS program, while small in size, right? If you look at it and do a similar digital sort of methods analysis, you will see that marketing, advertising, and consumer are not very present, not very significant. But of course, anthropology, business, design, and future are quite present. And you can see that by the larger nodes. Now, of course, it's worth noting that the conference is explicitly about futures and explicitly about anthropology and business. So you would expect that all of those really show up in the program. But, what about design? I mean, I guess you can compare it to making, but not necessarily explicitly there, but very present. If we remove those other nodes that I said, like anthropology, business, futures, we see that design really takes, center stage as the dominant node within that text. And it should be also noted that organizational and digital were there. So if I zoom in on just organizational, you'll notice it's light in color, but it's in the bottom right there. Kind of creates this little network of elements kind of neatly together, though not necessarily very central to the text. Then if I was to zoom in on digital, you will see that it's a little bit more central, a little bit more connected. So it's being talked about a little bit more in that program. But again, the program is relatively small in size. So what if we looked at 10 years of the JBA, the Journal of Business Anthropology? Here, basically, I'm pulling out just so you can see design and digital. You'll see that, design is, they're both very present, of course. Design is slightly more significant, slightly larger node, but they are there. But that's 10 years of the JBA. So what if we were to go back and just look at, say, the first year to see like just a quick comparison to see how things may have changed? If we do that and we run through the process of the semantic network analysis and then we do topic modeling, we see consumer research really jumps out and digital and design are not present. So at that point, it was not a hot topic yet. Whereas then over the course of 10 years, you start to see it come into the conversation, most notably maybe roughly 4 years ago when there was a special edition on design. So to contrast that, if I sort of come back now to all 10 years and do topic modeling again, you'll see workplace practices comes up. So kind of largely organizational. So that implies that there's a lot of conversation in 10 years of the JBA about organizational related concepts, but product design comes back into the 5th spot. So we see over 10 years that design is sort of picking up in there in terms of, from a topic modeling perspective. And if I went down further in that list, you do see digital ethnography, I think, as maybe 9th of the 9th topic. Now, similarly, if I looked at my podcast, and this is, again, 58 hours of podcast, you'll see both design and digital are quite present, though digital is actually more significant. And I think it's worth noting that my podcasts are now running for 2.5 years. So there's 58 hours in a 2.5 year period. So it's quite current, the conversation that's going on. And so to see digital kind of take over in that space within only that time frame, as opposed to the JBA, which is published 2 times a year, indicates to me that there is this internal sort of force happening, this internal shift towards digital. But of course, that's not the only trend that I'm talking about, the shift in focus. The other major shift that I hear on the podcast is really the shift in the speed or pace of research or the scope of research. If I quote Elizabeth Bridey from her episode, she says, "It was our job to produce these research reports, telling the story, using quotations to bolster whatever the argument was, relating it to the literature, just as you would in a scholarly article. Those reports were then peer reviewed by my colleagues. We usually had 2 to 3 peer reviews, right? And that's in a corporate setting, in a lab setting. Similarly, when speaking with Timothy Malafite or Patty Sunderland in private conversation, or also John Wendell in private conversation, I hear all of these enchanting stories about their research of the past, which was often multi-sited, often or frequently enough global, very frequently, well-funded. And that is something that when I speak with most people on my podcast, that doesn't come out like that these days. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm not saying we're not doing rigorous research anywhere. Of course, top big tech has some robustness to it. I'm sure there's many consultancies in here that are still doing a lot of multi-sited, global, wonderful work. But the general trend is I hear that it's getting quicker. And Rachel Fleming really sums this up when she says the pace is much faster. You're asked to turn around research very quickly. It's helpful to remember that this research is for completely different goals than academia. These agile product development questions are often very targeted. It's good to know their context and it's good to have that holistic viewpoint, but you have to turn it around quickly, right? And so this is something I hear all the time. And keep in mind this need to turn something around quickly. And now let's pivot to like the external environment. This should have shift to digital as I'm seeing it, the shift to like very sort of fast research is now happening in the context of this AI frenzy that has captured the imagination over the past 8 months. You have like articles and estimates by Goldman Sachs indicating that generative AI, only generative AI, one branch of AI could impact 300 million jobs. And you have companies like IBM and Dropbox who are already in part laying off people because of, the value that they see and value in their eyes in terms of lowering costs of picking up, sort of like capacity because of AI. And so, though our field has always been evolving, I'd argue we're about to witness new downward pressures that might force us to adapt really quicker than ever if we want to stay relevant compared to, disciplines such as data science and the broader AI field. And I believe this not just because of like the news stories, but there are plenty of surveys that you can go look at. Accenture being one of them. I know Accenture's, is represented today, and they had a great study with 4,777 global executives, in which two interesting findings jumped out at me. First is 96% of those global executives expressed that they were either very or extremely inspired by the new capabilities offered by AI foundational models. And again, AI foundational models is just, the foundational models are just generative AI, right? So one branch of AI. Furthermore, 97% agree that these models will enable connections across data types, revolutionizing where and how AI is used, which sounds very much like it has an impact on research, right? And I think you can see a similar impact even just from the broader public when you look at Google Trends, which allows us to look at search results just broadly. So this is worldwide from 2004 to present. And you will notice that data science and AI, data science has been on an uptick for a while. AI is on a very sharp uptick recently. And ethnography, is just sort of floating along. That doesn't mean that ethnography is not valuable, right? But it's in the public imagination, it is not the sort of go-to, tool, if you will, the method maybe when thinking about insights. And so I think we can also even see this in job postings. So I just went out and I was looking at LinkedIn job postings technically last week, but at that time there was 87,000 job postings for data science. Anthropology and ethnography are nearly non-existent. Now, I appreciate that you're often not going to see a job posting for ethnography or for anthropology necessarily as like that word. More so, I thought you would have seen it for ethnography because it's often something listed in like particularly UX research skills. But nonetheless, I appreciate that that's maybe not the way that jobs get posted. So if we look at that from a title perspective, it gets even worse. Data scientists, right? 114,000 and both anthropologists and ethnographer drop off. Now, what if we said, okay, well, again, even anthropologists and ethnographer aren't jobs that get, like, those aren't the titles that get posted in job posting. So I combine three that are common jobs. So like market research, UX research, consumer insights, appreciating that, that's not all the jobs we take on, right? But it's a good chunk at this period of time. You still see data science outpacing it by about 10,000. And then painting like an even more starker picture. If I bring in AI, right? AI outpaces data science. And there's probably a little overlap between like the AI and data science jobs. Like there could be, some of those might actually be the same, but I think, you see the picture. And again, I know I don't have all anthropological jobs in here, all the jobs we might assume, but the point here is, this is what's being posted. This is what's sought after. You could say maybe arguably from an insights perspective of how are we going to generate like the next generation of insights, right? And I think even these stats can be seen in a recent story that I'm sure many of us have heard, which is the closure of the library at Berkeley, right? Something near and dear to many people. I know this library was sort of like a bastion for many, in cohorts before me. But I think you can see in this, the main argument here is that they're reshifting funds essentially to technology-oriented subjects like data science, right? So even the universities are thinking this way. And we also have heard other stories like from the US, there's governors who basically are defunding anthropology or trying to say that it's, not valuable, right? So there's all these kind of cross currents pushing at us, not least this external business environment that is very sort of AI data science oriented. And really from a single perspective, it actually kind of makes sense, right? You only need to look at the recent like high profile rollouts of, Microsoft's new Bing Chat and Google's Bard, and now Google's generative search experience to realize like these products are coming fast and furious. I spend quite a bit of time per day trying to stay on top of all of the new tools that I want to incorporate into work, and it's becoming stressful, to be frank, right? I mean, they're coming that fast. And so, but to put it in perspective here of like how much innovation activity is happening in this space, you're not going to be able to see this, but this is an AI market map from FirstMark Capital. My hunch is they haven't even captured all of the AI startups, but this is what they've been able to capture. This is how many companies have started that are AI first, basically, or have significant divisions within much larger organizations that are AI first. This is what we're going to be competing against. And so from a perspective, you could see why job postings are targeting engineers, right? But of course, we know anthropologists, designers, strategists, we need to be present in those conversations. All of us here know that, right? We know we need to play a role in shaping those. And, I did see a bright spot recently. Chase the bank, when posting a VP role for a UX researcher, they had this posting which called for digital ethnography, which I rarely see. And I follow this stuff because I coach individuals who want to get into UX. So I follow job postings. So they're intentionally calling out digital ethnography. But what's maybe, a counterweight to that is they're asking for skill set focused on innovation in research methodologies, which I don't presume is like SPSS or something from the past. I presume it is something, more in the emerging tech category, right? And so these, stories, these traces, these data signals as we see it, I think imply the challenge we face in the contemporary job market. And really, whether or not the value of AI delivers in the short run, I think is somewhat irrelevant because the appetite is there for business. The cat is out of the bag and has been for about 30 months at this point in time. I can tell you, we've been using these tools for 30 months on a daily basis, right? And so it's cat is out of the bag. And many businesses, not all, but many, in pursuit of never-ending growth at lower costs, will almost certainly move in the direction of integrating more AI at breakneck speeds. And so I think we stand at the doorstep of a really massive shift in society. As businesses increasingly adopt AI, the research landscape will face consequential shifts, including an emphasis on doing research in new ways, likely with fewer people, within shorter periods of time, aided by digital technologies. And that is why I think we all need to be ready to respond and participate thoughtfully, but quickly if we are to stay relevant in this new context. So, of course, then the question, how do we stay relevant? I think we must continue doing what anthropology has always done, right? Which is being open, being adaptive, and embracing these technologies, not just as a point of study and critique, but as the future of anthropology and business. And don't get me wrong, we should study and critique because, as we know, technology is not neutral, and there are serious issues. From the weaponization or militarization of AI to the impact on climate, like generative AI is very, very climate intensive right now, to potentially catastrophic job displacement, to increased threats to democracy. Deepfakes have gotten amazingly good in only the past 3 months, right? So the list of potential dangers goes on and on. I'm not going to cover them all here. I've largely opted to talk about what our opportunities are and what our futures are, but the dangers are very real and very imminent. And so we need to take, in my opinion, this digital-first approach to developing new theories and methods that will help us navigate an AI-first society where humans are no longer the only creators and interpreters of knowledge. For in this era, we share the cognitive landscape with machines capable of learning, reasoning, using human language, and recursively self-improving. They can 10x over and over again in ways that we cannot. Right. And so we now share human language with a machine, which is quite startling in many ways. And so in this emerging AI dominated environment, we must play a pivotal role in designing and marketing these technologies, as well as leading the digital transformation for organizations and society at large. And luckily, there is already some progress I see happening in this space. Recently, there's been a noticeable uptick of anthropologists studying and working with the latest emerging digital technologies. And I should say that I know we have multiple, 3-4 generations of anthropologists who have worked in emerging technologies, luminaries like Genevieve Bell, Ken Anderson, Melissa Sefkin, and many others who have made entire careers out of working with emerging technologies in the tech sector. Fully aware of that. But there's also, there's a new crop that's emerging, which I'm encouraged by. But, building on those strengths of the past and building on researchers like Julia Glusing, who has very skillfully used digital methods, to service, for research purposes, to service some of the largest organizations in the world. I think we need to build on all of those threads. And I think this new group of researchers is doing that. And so what I see with these researchers is they're kind of digital native, they're early to mid-career, they grew up reading different material from a, anthropological perspective, and they identify with digital anthropology. And so individuals like Katie Hillier and Sydney Yeager and Isabel Cotton, Anthony Kelly, Gideon Singer, Nathalie Boucher, and Laura Musgrave, all of these individuals identify with digital anthropology on LinkedIn and work in business. Furthermore, this group is significantly contributing to the conversation out there, particularly on social media. Many of us have gone directly into practicing, so we may not have contributed like to journals and books as much as maybe some others in the past, but they are actively contributing nonetheless. And we can see that if I scrape data from Twitter, from like really from the beginning, from 2009 through the end period was March 11th when I did this to collect the data for this talk. You can see that digital anthropology, largely outpaces the others. And if we do a temporal analysis of that data, we can see that digital anthropology has actually always remained relatively present on Twitter. Design anthropology, while minimal, peaked in 2018, and business anthropology is on a pretty significant uptick, along with, again, digital anthropology. And so now, of course, like this analysis of n-grams, like, joined words, search trends, jobs, social data, I know that none of that offers a complete perspective about our evolution and like the changes that are occurring. And in some sense, I guess you can make the argument that particularly with like search data, maybe there's digital proficiencies that weigh into this data that give digital anthropology, a leg up. Nonetheless, when I take data like this and 58 hours of my podcast, 10 years of the JBA, and some other data that I'm working on right now to pull in various digital traces, I really see an emerging digital turn within business anthropology, which again, I believe may justifiably overtake design anthropology as the dominant narrative. And so if that happens, and if our field is in the midst of this very emerging digital turn, what opportunities does that offer us to improve our research, to communicate more effectively, and ultimately stay relevant in the new business landscape? To get a sense of those opportunities, I would suggest looking at the Live Center's global report on innovation. They partnered with UNESCO to focus on digital innovation in anthropology, and the recent digital edition of Anthropology News by the American Anthropological Association. If you read those, you will find researchers who are doing incredibly interesting work, not just, again, studying and critiquing or even contributing to the design of these tools, but more so incorporating these tools into their practice. And they're incorporating, technologies like neural networks, large language models and generative AI, robotics, and knowledge graphs. And you will see that these, that these technologies are playing an integral role in what it is that they're doing. It's actually, in a very abductive, iterative process that they're engaged in by combining them, not one or the other that is just being joined at some point, but used like holistically, as we would speak of. And so one of the individuals in there I mentioned earlier, Honest Christian Monk, he frequently makes use of artificial intelligence and is developing new digital methods to combine data science and anthropology. And that's largely what they're doing at the Technoanthropology Lab at Aalborg University. In his paper, The Thick Machine, he repurposes the failures of a neural network as a jumping off point for future embodied ethnographic inquiry, right? And in my case, I had an article in the digital edition. I talked about 10 predictions of how I see anthropology really being reshaped at large, but particularly anthropology in business. And so in that article, I lay out these 10 predictions, and I'm not going to go one by one, but I think I want to just summarize those into 4 big themes. So first, I see a very massive disruption that will touch all bodies or all fields of anthropology. It doesn't matter if it's archaeology, or cultural, or for applied. It's going to touch everybody. To that end, ethnography is going to be radically altered, in the way we collect data, analyze data, synthesize data, and present it for greater reach. And that data is going to be multimodal. These models already, most people are focused on text at the moment, but these models already handle text, voice, video, all of it. You're going to be able to take them in and put them out with great ease in the near future. To that end, AI should be viewed as a collaborative partner for us, not something that's a competition, but for the savvy researcher, something that's going to enable us to carry out our anthropological practice at a greater scale and really improve that anthropological practice. Second, automated digital ethnography is going to reshape digital ethnography as digital anthropology as we know it online. There will be automated bots. You can almost think of it as like social listening combined with robots that are crawling the web today in some sense, but more so carrying that out in a way that's actually anthropological. Because if you've played with most social listening tools, you will know they are not very anthropological today. So to do all of that, my third point is we need anthropology specific AI tools, not the ones that are on the market today, but we need to basically contribute to building our own or, not just contribute, but maybe even build them ourselves, right? And so we will need fine-tuned large language models that are trained on anthropological data, and we will need anthropological knowledge graphs. Now, let me just pick on the former for a second. How many of you have already used like generative AI tools? Okay, right, most of it. And how many of you think it's very anthropological? Yeah, exactly, right. It's not. And I make no, I'm not blind to that at all. But it can be actually, if you combine an anthropological knowledge graph with, a fine-tuned large language model, we can make it much more anthropological. And that's the work that I'm working towards. And you can see this if you want to demo something, go demo Glass AI. It's a tool for medicine, which combines a knowledge graph which is based on all the medical data, with a large language model trained on medical data. You will find you get quite medical responses back. So last point here is I think we need to reevaluate our role in designing, these technology solutions. No longer is it sufficient, I think, for us to just work as employees or consultants contributing to this, but I think we really need to productize anthropology ourselves. And so with that in mind, I really wish to make my last point about this impending digital turn. I see very bright futures of entrepreneurship for anthropologists who want to move beyond the traditional fee-for-service research model, which I'm not disparaging in any way. We need that. But I see great opportunity for those who want to go out and create product companies, right? Or sort of, software as a service companies, if you will. I believe that those who take up the task of productizing anthropological knowledge will lead us in a new direction. And so you have founder anthropologists like Laura Kocheva of Robots Actually, who is working to make sure that society can coexist with robots. And in her recent UNESCO piece that's paired with the Live Center, she put forward the idea of telepresent robots that can go places that we can't go to carry out embodied ethnography. And then Yaya Ren, who founded Premium U, a social benefit health startup working to improve premature infant health and development outcomes by using digital tools, all based on her medical anthropology dissertation. And then Malin McKay, who co-founded Colapay, a Web3 startup created to address the challenges of transferring money from donors to aid projects and ensuring that money goes to good use. Or myself, co-founder of ArtMatcher, a social app for the art space. With ArtMatcher, we designed a model to try and level the playing field for the mid-market by addressing issues of equity and access that are often amplified by recommender systems, such as those in Spotify, Amazon, etc., right? And so because those recommender systems often produce rich get richer results, those who are already popular or have capital to spend to kind of help that process, they float to the top. Most other people hang in the shadows. And so as part of this work, I use the anthropological concepts and understanding of capital and incorporated aspects of participation to create a patent pending gamified machine learning model that brings in this concept of behavioral capital, where we reward you for your hard work, so that even if you don't have economic social capital, kind of like, to run advertisements offline or to send something to your email list because you have a massive list, you can, through your hard work, through this designed, this patent pending model, contribute, in a productive way and help your art get seen more. And so for me, it is this type of humanistic innovation grounded in the idea of productizing anthropological understanding that is the frontier that we should be pushing towards. And so no longer, I feel, should we be fighting for a seat at the table. We should buy the table and staff it with whoever we think is best, right? We should staff it with people who willingly embrace an anthropological mindset and are committed to making conscious futures. Thank you.